Hello, welcome to our channel Contemporary Literary Review India. In today's discussion, I am with the author Nora Gold. Dr. Nora Gold is a prize-winning author. Her first book, Marrow and Other Stories, won a Wine Canadian Jewish Book Award and was admired by many big literary personalities, including Alice Munro. Her second book, Fields of Exile, won the inaugural Canadian Jewish Literary Award for Best Novel and was acclaimed by both Cynthia Ozick and Ruth Wisse. Her third book, The Dead Man, won a Canada Council for the Arts translation grant and was published in Hebrew. Before I move ahead, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon. Welcome to our channel, Dr. Nora Gold. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine, thank you. How are you today?
Very, very good. Would you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Certainly. I'm a Canadian writer, a former professor and social worker, and I'm also the founder and editor of the literary journal jewishfiction.net, which has published over 570 works of fiction so far in our first 13 years. They were either written in English or translated into English from 20 languages, but never before published in English.
Okay, that's great. So how many books have you got published till date?
Well, I have 3 published so far, and I have 2 more books coming out in the next 5 months. The ones that have been published so far are Marrow and Other Stories, my first book, and 2 novels, Fields of Exile, which was about anti-Israelism on campuses, university campuses, and The Dead Man, which is about a composer who can't get over a love relationship that ended badly. My books have won Canadian Jewish Book Award, Canadian Jewish Literary Award, and translation grant from Canada Council for the Arts, and praise from Alice Munro, if I may say so. And in the next few months, I have 2 books coming out, as I said. The first of them is just in 2 weeks, called 18, Jewish Stories Translated from 18 Languages. And then this is an anthology of stories from jewishfiction.net that is received already really wonderful advance reviews. And my 5th book, which is coming out March 1st, is 2 of my novellas. They're called In Sickness and in Health and Yom Kippur in a Gym.
Okay. So actually, I would like to congratulate you on all these appreciations from across the platforms.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm happy to have met you in that way from the online world, Krishid.
Okay, that's great, because that is the power of social media platforms.
It is. It is. People see all sorts of negatives there, but there are such wonderful positives. We're very fortunate, I think.
What kind of literature do you write? What topics do you talk about in your fiction generally?
Well, I write literary fiction. I make sure, though, that it's in a style that is accessible to any reader. It's not difficult to read. The topics I touch on are really the usual human ones of human experience, love, loss, relationships, belonging, not belonging, hope, moral conflicts, loneliness, injustice, sexism, kindness, sex, friendship, more. Just about everything that's human ends up in my books in one way or another. I would say that in my books, the characters struggle, but there's meaning to their struggles. They do their best with the challenges of life, just like the rest of us do. And my books are also, they have some serious content, definitely, but they're also full of humor and joie de vivre and really full of the pleasures of everyday life.
So nice. Yes, so humans actually have so many struggles in life, right? So
Indeed.
obviously we would be much interested to understand what struggles do you actually portray in your fiction. So can you tell me something about your fiction, Marrow and Other Stories, the first one?
Yes. Well, your first book in a way always has a special place in your heart. It also won a Canadian Jewish Book Award and resulted in a postcard from Alice Munro that said bravo, which, first of all, of course, thrilled me, but also encouraged me to keep writing, because at that point I was trying to decide whether to leave my academic career. I was a full-time professor, or to be a writer full-time. And this helped me decide that I really wanted to be writing. Marrow is comprised of 6 stories and a novella. The title story, Marrow, is set in Israel. It's about the violence of the first Intifada there, and the effect it has emotionally and physically on a Canadian woman who's visiting Israel at that time. The other stories deal with different themes, each one. For example, one of them is about the anorexia of a girl's cousin and what the girl can and can't do to save her. Another one is about discovering that someone you really admired has been unfaithful, has been sexually unfaithful to a friend of yours. One of them is a feminist retelling of the Joseph story in the Bible. The novella in Marrow, called The Lesson of the Rabbi, was actually the first expose of sexual abuse by a rabbi in literature. And it caused a real stir in Jewish feminist circles at the time, and I would say more broadly in the Jewish community as well.
Oh, most of your writing, I think, raises the questions around exile. Am I right?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question you ask. Certainly, Fields of Exile has exile, not only in the title, but as the central focus of the novel. It's about the experience of being a Canadian Jew living in exile from Israel, which is how she experiences it. Being apart from Israel is a form of exile for her. And that's different, of course, than just the experience of being in the diaspora. It's quite different, obviously. But not all my books deal with this theme in such an overt way. But I would say I'm very deeply attached to Israel, and I experience myself quite often as living in exile. And running through all of my work, really, Israel is definitely a clear thread that you could identify.
Okay. So when you talk about like exile, so how do you differentiate between like exile, uh, um, a type of life, like you are living in a different country, means separated from your culture? So what is the feeling that you actually suffer from?
Boy, that's a wonderful question also. A Jew who lives in the diaspora, and of course, not all my books are about being Jewish, but since I'm a Jew, it's certainly part of it. There are a lot of Jews living in the diaspora who are fine with it. They're Jewish Canadians or Canadian Jews or whatever you call this kind of hyphenated existence that people live, just as an Indian person living in Canada, is an Indian Canadian or Canadian Indian, whatever, however they choose to define themselves. I think if you feel exile, it means that you're away from home. That's something that most of the Canadian Jews around me, I would say almost all, don't feel that they're not at home. They feel that they're at home in Canada, and they happen to be Jewish. For me, I have both Canadian and Israeli citizenship, having moved to Israel at a certain point and embraced Israeli citizenship. And I experience Canada as my home in one way, but also Israel as my home. So the feeling of exile is that I'm not at home. And that creates or expresses a certain, I wouldn't say alienation, but a certain distance from the surroundings of where one is living. And I experience things differently because of that. And And exile isn't a good feeling. In fact, a very close friend of mine in Israel just died this morning, a few hours ago. And I just want to be on a plane and I want to be there, both to be with her and to be in the place where she made her home. I don't know if that's a full answer, but it's the best I can do at the moment.
Your special focus is to bring out the writing on Jewish themes to the world. Which writers are writing in Hebrew, or do you think are the gems that the world must know?
Thank you. Well, it's hard to recommend just a few writers writing in Hebrew because there's so many that are fantastic. And in my journal, jewishfiction.net, by now I've published over 100 translations from Hebrew. So, many people just know the 3 or 4 big names. For me, I really know and appreciate. Oh, well, I've published over 100. I know many more than 100, of course. For my book, 18, I had to pick one Hebrew, I wouldn't say representative, but one selection. And I chose an excerpt from a novella by Agnon, Shmuel Yosef Agnon, who is an astonishing, extraordinary writer, a Hebrew writer, not contemporary, no longer living, but a classic who really influenced Hebrew literature and Jewish literature profoundly. In terms of gems that the world must know, I would suggest, and I don't mean this in a self-promoting way, but simply because there's no other resource like it, I would suggest starting with the works in the book 18, which is coming out in 2 weeks, because that book gives you an excellent introduction to Jewish literature around the world. I mean, many people just think of Jewish fiction as being what they know. If they're native English speakers, of course, they just think of American Jewish literature written in English. Most
Right.
Jews know about some Hebrew, Yiddish, maybe Ladino, but people aren't aware that it's really a multicultural and multilingual tradition, which is what it is. So if you read 18, and that's the first book in 25 years to showcase the multilingualism of Jewish literature, you can read stories, Jewish themed stories translated from Albanian, Croatian, Czech, Danish, French, German, Greek, Hebrew, Hungarian, Italian, Ladino, Polish, Portuguese, Romanian, Russian, Spanish, Turkish, and Yiddish. So you really can get a sense of what Jewish literature is around the world. And also something that really excites me, there's a Jewish themed novel in India, the first one in 50 years. You'll have to forgive my pronunciation. It's called Miss Samuel Ek Yehudi Gatha, something like that, by Sheila Rohekar.
Okay.
And it's very, very, it's extraordinary. I'm dying to see it translated into English. The translator is Madhu Singh. And I think it's soon to be published in India. It may already have been, but I'm trying very hard to get a look at it. And I would love to have an excerpt from this novel for jewishfiction.net.
Okay. See, as your contribution is on various sides, including writing, publishing, what do you think is the responsibility of an author in today's time? Today, why I said in today's time, because there are so many writers nowadays. Okay, almost every other educated person brings out one book. Okay,
it's true. And that's good. I mean, I like the democracy of that everyone feels they can write. But yes, this is a time, again, we were talking about briefly the people who are against or critical of social media, but really one thing that it's done is it's gotten people writing instead of just talking on the phone. So I think that's a great thing. The responsibility of the writer. Well, to me, writing means writing the truth. Not every writer, of course, sees it that way, but that's how I see it. So I think of writers as truth tellers. And people will say, well, but you write fiction. But that's not a contradiction, because even Camus said, fiction is the lie through which we tell the truth. So fiction is actually a wonderful vehicle for telling the truth. And in my first book, Marrow, I told the truth in the lesson of the rabbi about something that no one in the Jewish community was willing to talk about. And I think I do this in everything I write. In my forthcoming novellas, the ones coming out in March 2024, one of them is about growing up with epilepsy, which is an illness, or it's not exactly an illness. It's a condition that is very, very stigmatized in ways that other conditions, medical conditions, are not. And telling the truth about that actually required a very special kind of courage on my part, I have to say. I want to add, though, that, I mean, I think all writers require a certain kind of courage, but also not to idealize writers or make writers better or fundamentally different from anybody else. I think living in today's world requires courage. I mean, for anybody, because remaining human, remaining a good person who's good to others and who thinks and questions and feels and continues to care about that world, that's a challenge today, because it's a very rough and frightening and in many ways evil world, and continuing to remain human is in a way something that requires courage. That said, I think authors, like all artists, have a certain extra responsibility in addition to the responsibility that all humans feel, and that is to use our voice for good.
Okay. Here I would like to add that it's very difficult and costly to be a true person, or to say something real, or bring truth to the world, or in writing.
It
Right?
is. There are costs. There's no question about it. And, you know, the first time that I showed my writing to anybody, I was 12 years old. I showed it to a teacher. I was in 7th grade, and she didn't believe I wrote it. And I got punished by the principal. I got kicked out of school. I remember, you know, I think about that incident quite a lot, because at one level you could say it's trivial. I mean, I wasn't, as so many writers are imprisoned or murdered for what they write. So I'm not, you know, if you Amnesty International and Penn International, you know, obviously. But for a child, that was a profoundly shocking experience. And I never forgot that writing can be very dangerous. And you know, there are people who perhaps write down and, you know, sit down at their desk and they just write. For me, it's always frightening. There's always something about overcoming. I don't know if that's the case for you, but there's something to overcome. And it's not only personal inhibitions or, you know, will this be good? It's not just the usual stuff. It's also the danger of telling the truth in this world.
True.
Yeah.
True. Okay. At some point, you actually highlighted that you were full-time professor.
I was.
And you just chose writing, right? So what
Yes.
was the journey like? Because it may be like that you are already having some profession and you want to move to writing, which is not a fixed, would not bring you fixed remuneration, right?
Absolutely. Excellent. You ask wonderful questions, Gurshit. Yes, for me, that was a very hard decision. There are people who are only good at one thing. And for them, and that's writing in some cases. You know, Alice Munro said, I'm only good at one thing. Well, she's amazing at the one thing. I was fortunate in the sense that I was also very successful in my other career, which was a social work professor. I was a social worker and then a professor. And, you know, writing is much harder than anything I've ever done for many reasons. One is, you know, if you're a professor, you publish. It was easy for me to get my articles published. I was well liked by the students. I got grants, research grants. It's easy to be successful if you're reasonably good at what you do. With writing, and again, this may be something you want to comment on, but you're sort of never there. I mean, it's never like you apply for a grant and you get the grant. I mean, yes, I got a translation
Correct.
grant, but I mean, you're there are always writers who are more well-known and more successful. Certainly as a writer, you don't earn anything, or a writer like me doesn't. I don't know any writer who can live on what they make. There may be 10 writers in Canada who can live off writing. So yes, this was a very, very hard decision. As I mentioned, Marrow and Other Stories had already come out. And I give credit to one particular person for helping me to make this decision, because I knew that I needed advice. I didn't know any writers at the time. And the local library, the Toronto Public Library, had a writer in residence that you could go to and show your work, and then she'd meet with you. And I was lucky. It was a wonderful writer named Audrey Thomas, a Canadian writer. She looked at what I'd written. She said, you're a real writer. And I was, of course, very happy. And then she asked about my schedule. And I said, well, I teach at a university an hour away from my home. I leave early in the morning. I come home late at night. Not late at night. I come home at supper time. I have a young child. I have a husband. I have a social life. I do volunteer work and activism. I don't have enough time. And she just looked at me and she said, you only go around once, which I didn't understand at first. I actually had to make her repeat it because I thought, what? And then, of course, I heard her. And I went home, and I think that was really the first time that I understood really that, well, the one doesn't live forever. This was a long time ago. I'm older now, but back then I was in my 40s, and you sort of think you could live forever, or it's far away anyway, the idea of finitude. But also I understood that it was going to come at a cost, as you said, not just a financial cost. It was going to come with many costs, and it has, but I don't regret it for a single moment. I feel incredibly lucky that I'm able to do with my life what I want to be doing. And so many people aren't able to say that.
Okay. So out of all these books, which one is selling in huge number?
Well, it's interesting, Marrow came out in 1998. So, that's a really old book. It's still on Amazon, to my astonishment, which means people are buying it. Fields of Exile, my second book, which was my first novel, seems to have a life of its own. I don't know exactly what it's selling, but it's having a kind of rebirth. The topic, as I mentioned briefly, is about hatred of Israel, not only on Canadian university campuses, but throughout the world. And I don't use the word hatred lightly. I don't mean critical of Israel. I am critical of Israel, even though it's a country I love. I am, for example, extremely critical of the current government. So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about hatred, which is anti-Israelism, which is a form of anti-Semitism. It's hating Israel basically because it's a Jewish country. And there's an activist. I did research on anti-Semitism as an academic, so I know this field. And a group of social workers recently decided to use the book Fields of Exile, with my permission, of course, and I got my publisher's permission, of course, to mount an activist campaign about hatred of Israel on Canadian campuses and around the world. And they're using excerpts of the book, and they've hired actors. They're acting out certain key scenes from the book, where this student, a young woman who had been living in Israel, comes back to Canada to do a master's in social work, and she's a left-wing person.
Okay.
She has volunteered to bring together Jews and Arabs, so she thinks she'll be okay, that she'll fit in, but she doesn't, because any association with Israel makes you complicit with evil. And so this book is now going to be attracting a lot of attention because of its activist content, which, you know, when I wrote the book, actually, it took 7 years to write and then 7 years to find a publisher for. And I kept thinking, you know, by the time this book comes out, this is going to be irrelevant. No one, this problem, social problem, will be solved.
Right.
And I have to say that, to my great sadness and anger, I would say, you know, the social issue that is the core of the book is just getting more and more serious every year. And that's a long answer to a short question, but it's very interesting what gives a book life or not. And I'm astonished that this book continues to be relevant.
Even today.
Even today, unfortunately. Unfortunately, I wish it weren't relevant still.
Okay. Now we are coming to the conclusion of our interview and discussion. So where can people buy your books from?
Well, all the usual places, you know, obviously Amazon. The publisher of 18, my new book, is Academic Studies Press. My book can be bought from their website directly, and they ship around the world, they've told me. I also have some of my stories on my website, noragold.com. Some of the stories from Marrow, such as Marrow and the prayer. And I believe the lesson of the rabbi is there as well, if people don't want to go and buy the whole book. I would say my books are actually sold not only on Amazon, but pretty much any of the major places where books are sold. And I'm sure I hope they will be available to readers in India as well.
Okay, nice. If you have anything special to share with our audience.
Something special to share. Well, I would say that writing is the hardest thing I've ever done. And at the same time, it's, you know, a certain way the easiest, because it just comes. It doesn't feel like work, you know. The work of editing, and certainly the work of finding a publisher and promoting a book, which is the phase I'm in now. I'm, of course, in book promotion mode for 18 and soon for the 2 novellas, In Sickness and in Health. But the actual, the joy of writing is something that I would like to leave you with, of actually being able to experience life at the deepest level and to be able to create and to share that with other people. That's the greatest joy there is. And that's when I feel most alive.
Okay. Thanks for sharing your views and having this beautiful discussion.
And thank you so much. I feel very honored to have been speaking with you. It's been a real pleasure.
Okay.